Hey everyone, my name is Dave and this here is Honcho. And this is the 6L90 transmission that we use at the Baja 1000. This is what its pan looks like. And here's what its oil looks like. Today, I'm going to show you everything I did to swap this transmission out for a new one, all the torque specs I use, and all the tools I use to put it back together. First, let's start with pulling the transmission out of the truck.
So this is the first full race truck I've ever built. And so one of the flaws I think in my design was that I was unable to drop the transmission out the bottom. So basically the engine and transmission have got to come out of this truck together, which means I've got to take everything out, seats, firewalls, everything, to get the entire electrical wiring harness and everything out with the engine and transmission all together. So from there, I drain a little bit of fluids, and then I go employ my 8-year-old son to come over, and he just thinks it's really cool that he is able to lift about 700-800 pounds of engine and transmission all by himself while I guide the engine out. The more that I use it, the more that I am a fan of this gantry setup. This is a 4,000-pound gantry, almost more than I was of the 2-post lift I had, just because I can get underneath the truck no problem since it's a truck. And just lifting was what I mostly had problems with. Check out the link in our description below or the Amazon store if you are looking for the same kind of thing for your shop.
All right, well, maybe not the best transmission in the world, but hopefully it'll last about 1,500 miles. That's all it needs to last for us. Here's something I do is I look up on the internet the torque pattern and also the torque rating for all the bolts. And I write it on the pan, and I put just so later on when I'm underneath the truck, having to pull this thing down for some reason, then they're right there. I don't have to go look them up, and it's really easy to kind of go around there and torque these things down. So I'm gonna start with 40 inch-pounds, and then I'll hit it one time all the way around with 80 inch-pounds. I know most of you will be doing this work with the transmission still in whatever truck or vehicle you have, but I have it out, so to make it easy to see everything, let's go ahead and start here with getting the electric plug off. Plug is super simple. This white tab has to be pulled out, and once it's out, you flip this lever up, and then you can pull the plug right out. Over here on the starter, there are two 13mm bolts that will take the starter right out. All right, one 10mm will get this dust cover off. Now that dust cover is off, we need to expose the bolts that connect the flex plate to the torque converter. And what I use is just a simple pry bar, and I get it down here at the very bottom, and I just start grabbing the teeth of the flex plate, and I just start rolling it over until I expose those bolts. Those bolts, once they come up, they should be about 15mm. What I find is if I can bring those bolts all the way up here to the corner, I can get the one of my 1/2-inch size 15mm in there, and I can go ahead and break those loose. All right, connecting the transmission to the engine is just a couple bolts here. First, you can start with some 13mm, and these just kind of hold on some of the things like this dipstick here. You can take those off, and the dipstick will come out pretty easily from the transmission, and set that thing aside. Once those are off, and it's just 15mm or what's holding on the rest of the transmission, I generally put a swivel on there just so I can kind of get to the more remote ones.
Once again, check out how useful that gantry is. And once those bolts are off all the way around the bell housing, that transmission is going to come right off the engine. So let me just say, I hate automatic transmission fluid. I hate the way it smells and the way it feels. It gets everywhere. But anyway, I dropped my microphone in the ATF bucket, so I'm going to do a little voiceover. Here is the torque converter going back into the transmission, and people hear about the 2 clicks it's got to do. I'm showing you here. You can kind of see how as you rotate it, it clicks once and then twice, and that is how you know that it is completely seated inside the transmission before you hook it up to your engine. One other surefire way to make sure that torque converter is all the way in there is to measure how far the face of the torque converter is from the face of the bell housing. And that's what you see me doing here. And there are values for that you can look at, or you can just measure it before you take the torque converter out of the transmission to make sure that it goes in and the dimensions are the same before you reconnect that torque converter to the flex plate. So did I mention how useful the gantry is? It makes really short work of lining up the face of the bell housing with the face of the engine. Those things go flush, and then we're just going to run some bolts in finger tight just to hold that thing together before we connect the torque converter to the flex plate. All right, so getting this new transmission connected up, you can rotate the engine over, again, one of two ways. One with the crowbar, like I showed you, up against the flex plate. It doesn't do any damage to those teeth for the starter. Or two is, since I am doing a cam swap later out, I got the engine out, I have access to the bolt that connects the harmonic balancer to the crankshaft. That's a 22 millimeter, and with the spark plugs removed, it is really easy to rotate that thing over because there's no compression on the engine. It makes it really easy to line up the holes on the flex plate and the torque converter. Let's go ahead and take a look at those. Looking back inside the hole where the starter will go, you'll see the flex plate and the torque converter. You should be able to reach your hand in there and spin that torque converter without it running into anything or having any resistance. And if you can't, then it's probably because there wasn't, the 2 clicks as the torque converter goes back into the transmission. So it basically isn't in there far enough. At this point, I recommend you stop, take the transmission back out, reset the torque converter, put it back together, and get back to this step. All right, here is one of those steps where there really isn't a lot of really solid information on how you basically connect the torque converter to the flex plate. So this is what I did, and you can do it if you want the same way. I will use red Loctite to hold those bolts into the torque converter. I'm basically going to thread each one of those all the way around finger tight just to make sure I can line up the holes with the torque converter as I spin it around. I'm going to spin around one more time with the ratchet and a 15 millimeter and just make them wrist tight. Get them, I don't know, probably about to 15 foot-pounds of torque all the way around. Make sure that flex plate is mounted flat with the torque converter. And then here is the big crux, how many foot-pounds? And if you go through the internet, you'll see there's all kinds of different numbers, and it just felt like 35 foot-pounds was just about right for these size bolts. So that is what I will use. You'll see other numbers like 75 and those kinds of things, but as I watch those videos, I think they're using larger bolts. So I use 35 foot-pounds, and if I blow them up or something like that, I'll be the first one to let you know in the next transmission video. A 10 millimeter socket puts the dust cover on. I just make that thing wrist tight. A 13 millimeter puts the bolts on for the starter, and those will be torqued down to 37 foot-pounds of torque. So this is the point. I'm going to go back and torque the bolts from the bell housing to the engine block. The end torque rating is 37 foot-pounds. I'm going to go around in a kind of a cross pattern back and forth so that I don't kind of torque one side of the bell housing too much. With about half the torque, I'm shooting probably for about 18 foot-pounds, and then I'm going to come around with the torque wrench for 37 foot-pounds. All right, here is a little sneak peek of the engine and transmission going back into Honcho. And if you're interested how it does, tune in for the next episode. We're doing a cam swap and then a poor man's tune on this thing, and then running it at the mid 400s. Some really cool stuff coming up.
So if you have a 6L90 transmission in your rig, check out one of my previous videos where I show you how I swap mine into a tap up, tap down sport shift. It totally changed the way that we're able to drive the truck. And if you like this content, like and subscribe, do all that kind of stuff. Leave a comment below. It sure helps us out and we do appreciate it. Next video, we're doing a cam swap and then a poor man's tune on this engine. Hope to see you next week. Take care of yourself.